The language of paradox. The language of poetry is the language of paradox, the language of sophistry, hard, bright and witty. It is not the language of the soul. It is considered intellectual then emotional and rational then irrational. This makes it a permissible feature of an epigram or a satire, sub-varieties of poetry, but not of poetry itself. This is merely a matter of prejudice. There is a sense in which paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry. Poetic truth can be approached only in terms of paradox. William Wordsworth is a poet who distrusts sophistry and relies greatly on simplicity. His poems would not provide too many examples of paradoxes. Yet, a typical Wordsworth poem is based upon a paradoxical situation. His famous "It is a beauteous evening." It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. The poet is filled with worship, but the girl who walks with him is not. The implication is that she should become nun-like as the evening is, making her less worshipful than the inanimate nature. Yet the poet goes on to say, "If thou appear untouched by solemn thought, thy nature is therefore not less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshipest at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it not." The underlying paradox is striking. The innocent girl, with her unconscious sympathy for all of nature, worships more deeply than the self-conscious poet whose devotion is momentary and sporadic. The paradox runs deeper than this contrast. It both underlies and informs the poem, as can be seen in the employment of the epithet nun for the evening. The calm of the evening represents worship, which corresponds to the visible trappings of the nun. It suggests not a mere holiness, but a pharisaical holiness, a foil to the symbol of her continual secret worship. Wordsworth's sonnet composed upon Westminster Bridge is one of his most successful poems, but readers find it difficult to account for its goodness. It cannot be attributed to nobility of sentiment, as the poem contains some very flat writing as well as well-worn comparisons. The power of the poem seems to be drawn from the fact that the speaker is honestly surprised. In expressing his odd surprise that the city should be able to wear the beauty of the morning at all, the poem creates points of almost shocked expression. Never did the sun more beautifully steep in his splendor, valley, rock or hill. The poem closes, "Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still." This is in principle what Wordsworth has stated in the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads. To choose incidents and situations from common life, but to treat them that ordinary things should be preserved to the mind in an unusual aspect. In short, Wordsworth inverted set ideals about the language of poetry and showed his audience that common was really uncommon and the prosaic was really poetic. Coleridge and his statements, "The charm of novelty to things of every day, awakening the mind," represent the romantic preoccupation with wonder, the surprise, the revelation which changes our view of the familiar world. This is exactly the way in which neoclassical poets use paradoxes. Though it is true, here, to say that paradoxes insist on the irony, rather than the wonder. Wordsworth's poetry has an implicit sense of wonder in them, while Pope's works give a certain sense of odd wonder. In poets like Blake and Coleridge, they merge with variations in emphasis. It is possible to see from the above examples that the paradoxes spring from the very nature of the poet's language. It is a language in which the connotations as well as denotations are relevant. The poet has to make up his language as he goes. T.S. Eliot has commented upon that perpetual slight alteration of language, words perpetually juxtaposed in new and sudden combinations, which occurs in poetry. It is a perpetual part of the craft of poetry and cannot be kept out, but can only be directed and controlled. The poet must work by contradiction and qualification. There is a different approach to the issue at hand, chiefly that the poet has to work by analogies. All subtler states of emotion demands metaphors for their expression. It is, however, not possible that the metaphors will fit on the same plane. This makes the continual tilting of the planes an immediate necessity. Even the most direct and simple poet has to resort to discrepancies, contradictions and paradoxes. He is forced into using paradoxes by the nature of his poetic instrument. The poet is not defeated by this task, nor is the poem reduced to shallow sophistry. There are, of course, perils to consciously employing paradoxes, but the dangers are not overpowering. The method is only an extension of the normal language of poetry, not a pervasion of it. John Donne's canonization is a concrete example in which the basic metaphor that underlies the poem involves a paradox. The poet daringly treats profane love as if it were divine love. Canonization is not offered to two holy anchorites who have renounced all pleasures of the world and the flesh, but to two lovers, whose hermitage is each other's body. It is an intense and serious parody of a normally sacred ritual. Donne takes neither love nor sainthood seriously, but merely exercises his wit with a cynical and bawdy lyric. The poem opens dramatically. The you, whom the speaker addresses in a tone of exasperation, is unidentified. It is clear that this person considers love as a silly affectation. He represents the secular world the lovers have renounced. The metaphor suggested in the first lines of the poem makes several clear implications. Chide my palsy, or my gout. My 5 gray hairs, or ruined fortune flout. The first implication is that if his friend wants to consider his love an infirmity or a disease, he is free to do so. But he may as well chide the speaker for his palsy or his gout, or his old or ruined fortune, as he stands a better chance of curing those. He neatly and contemptuously epitomizes the two main categories of secular success in the line, or the king's real, or his stamped face. The friend is free to look after his own welfare instead of worrying about the speaker's giving up his well-being in the pursuit of love. He advises the friend to cultivate courtly manners and gaze at the king's face, or earn money and stare at his face on the stamped coins. But he is to let the speaker alone. The conflict between the real world and the lover absorbed in the world of love runs through the poem. In fact, it dominates the second stanza, in which the torments of love, which are so very vivid to the lover, have no effect on the real world at all. What merchants' ships have my sighs drowned? The conflict again appears in the fourth stanza in the way the words chronicle and sonnets are set up as foils. The first representing secular history with its pomp and splendor, while the second represents trivial and precious intricacy. This is resolved only when the unworldly lovers, having given up the world, paradoxically achieve a more intense world. The dominant metaphor of the holy anchorite who by giving up this world achieves a better world is true here. The importance of the role of the second and third stanzas of the poem is that the poet changes the tone of the poem in them. The tone of irritation that is seen at the opening of the poem becomes something very different. The second stanza is replete with images from traditional Petrarchan imagery, the wind of lovers' sighs, the flood of lovers' tears. The implication is that the poet himself recognizes the absurdity of these love metaphors. The very absurdity of the lovers' jargon strengthens the poet's argument. Their love, however absurd, will do no harm to the world. The practical friend will still have wars to fight and lawsuits to argue. The opening of the third stanza suggests that this vein of irony is to be maintained. The poet points out to his friend the infinite fund of such absurdities which can be applied to lovers.